There's a point after 50 where financial mistakes stop being small. They don't always look dramatic, but they carry more weight than they used to, because time is different now. It's no longer something you assume you have plenty of. It's something you begin to measure more carefully. And because of that, every decision matters more. Not just the big ones, but the small, repeated choices that seem harmless in the moment. The ones you don't question because they feel familiar, because you've been making them for years without thinking twice. That's where the real danger is. Not in obvious mistakes, but in patterns that go unnoticed. Habits that once felt safe, responsible, even wise, but no longer lead where you think they do. And because they don't feel wrong, they continue quietly in the background. Most people expect financial problems to come from big risks, bad investments, sudden losses. But after 50, it's often the opposite. It's the things that feel secure, the decisions that seem careful, that end up costing the most over time. Because what feels safe is not always what moves you forward. There is a shift that happens at this stage of life, a tendency to protect instead of grow, to hold instead of position, to avoid uncertainty, even if it means missing opportunity. And while that feels responsible, it can slowly limit your future. It doesn't happen all at once. It builds gradually, one decision at a time, 1 year at a time, until you look back and realize that time has passed, but your position hasn't changed the way you expected it to. That realization can feel uncomfortable because you've been doing what you thought was right. You've been careful, you've been consistent, and yet something feels incomplete, like the progress doesn't match the effort you've put in. That's when awareness becomes critical, because the difference between staying stuck and moving forward is not how hard you work. It's whether you can recognize the patterns that are no longer serving you. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. You begin to notice where time is being lost, where opportunities are being passed over, where decisions are being made out of habit instead of intention. And that awareness begins to shift how you think. But most people never reach that point. They continue doing what feels comfortable. They avoid looking too closely. They tell themselves things will work out over time. And without realizing it, they repeat the same patterns year after year. That's where the cost builds. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily, quietly, until the gap between where they are and where they want to be becomes harder to close. Because after 50, recovery takes longer. That's the part few people want to admit. Mistakes don't just cost money, they cost time. And time, once it's used, doesn't come back. Which means the margin for error becomes smaller. But here's what changes everything. Awareness gives you control. The moment you recognize what's been holding you back, you gain the ability to adjust, to make different decisions, to move in a direction that actually supports where you want to go. And those adjustments don't have to be massive. They can be small, deliberate changes in how you think, how you act, how you approach money. But over time, those small changes begin to compound into something meaningful. Because just as mistakes build slowly, so does progress. The key is knowing which patterns to break and which ones to strengthen. What you're about to hear is not about fear. It's not about regret. It's about clarity. About seeing what most people overlook, until it's too late and understanding what you can still do about it now. Because it's not too late to improve your position, but it is too late to ignore it. Every year that passes without change adds weight to the outcome, but every year used correctly can begin to shift things back in your favor. The difference lies in what you choose to see and what you choose to do next. So don't treat this as just information. Treat it as a moment to pause, to reflect, to recognize where you are and where you're heading if nothing changes. Because once you see it clearly, you have a choice to continue the same path or to begin moving in a direction that finally works for you instead of against you. There comes a stage in a man's life when his thinking begins to change in a manner so gradual that he seldom recognizes it. It is not brought about by failure nor by any single event. It is the result of time, experience, and repeated exposure to both success and disappointment. And within this shift lies one of the most dangerous financial errors a man can make. In earlier years, a man is inclined toward advancement. He seeks opportunity, he takes action, and he is willing to move into uncertainty in pursuit of greater result. His thinking is directed toward increase. He measures his progress not by what he preserves, but by what he builds. Yet as time passes, there is a tendency for this orientation to reverse. The man begins to place greater emphasis on what he has rather than what he may create. He becomes more cautious, more deliberate, and more protective. These qualities appear wise, and in part they are. But when they become dominant, they begin to restrict movement. This shift does not announce itself as limitation. It appears as responsibility. A man tells himself that he must now be careful, that he must avoid unnecessary risk, and that preserving what he has is of greater importance than seeking more. These thoughts seem reasonable, and therefore they are rarely questioned. Yet beneath this reasoning lies a quiet danger. When protection becomes the primary aim, growth is gradually reduced. Not eliminated at once, but diminished over time. The man continues to act, continues to manage, continues to maintain, but the forward movement that once defined his actions begins to slow. There is a distinction that must be clearly understood. Protection preserves position. Growth improves it. When one replaces the other entirely, the result is not stability, but stagnation. A man may remain in place, yet he is no longer advancing. This condition is reinforced through repetition. Each cautious decision confirms the next. Each avoided opportunity strengthens the belief that avoidance is the correct course. Over time, the pattern becomes fixed. What began as a single adjustment becomes a way of thinking. Many men reach this stage without recognizing it. They believe they are acting wisely, and in a sense they are. They avoid unnecessary loss, maintain their responsibilities, and proceed without disruption. Yet when they pause to examine their position, they find that little has changed. Years may pass, and the result remains largely the same. This is not due to lack of effort. It is due to lack of expansion. There are examples of individuals who have lived within this pattern for extended periods. They earned steadily, saved consistently, and avoided what they perceived as risk. Yet despite their discipline, their position did not strengthen as expected. They preserved, but they did not grow. In contrast, there are those who, even in later years, maintained an orientation toward increase. They did not abandon caution, but they did not allow it to dominate their thinking. They continued to position themselves where growth was possible, applying their experience with greater precision. Such individuals often appear different to others. They are not reckless, yet they are not confined. They are deliberate, yet they are not stagnant. Their actions suggest that they understand something others do not, that protection alone is not sufficient. Others begin to perceive them as composed, confident, and forward-moving. They are seen not as those who are merely maintaining, but as those who are still building. This perception creates opportunity, for those who are seen as advancing are treated differently than those who are seen as holding. There is an affirmation that may be introduced to counter the drift toward excessive protection. I protect what I have, but I do not abandon growth for comfort. This statement does not reject caution, it refines it. It reminds the individual that preservation and expansion must exist together. One without the other produces imbalance. As this idea is considered, the individual begins to examine his own decisions more closely. He asks not only whether a choice is safe, but whether it leads forward. He considers not only what he may lose, but what he may gain through proper direction. This examination produces awareness. He begins to notice where his thinking has become restricted, where he has avoided movement not because it was unwise, but because it was unfamiliar, where he has chosen comfort over positioning, even when opportunity was present. There may be resistance in this realization. The mind prefers certainty, especially after years of experience. It suggests that maintaining the present condition is sufficient, that seeking more introduces unnecessary complication. Yet these suggestions must be questioned, for what appears sufficient today may not remain so tomorrow. The man who understands this does not abandon protection. He integrates it with growth. He preserves what he has built while continuing to extend it. He does not retreat from opportunity, he approaches it with understanding. This approach changes his actions. He no longer avoids movement entirely. He selects it carefully. He positions himself where his experience may be applied, where his effort may produce result, and where his time is used effectively. Over time, this balance begins to produce visible change. The individual is no longer static. He is advancing, though perhaps in a more measured way than before. His actions are not driven by impulse, but by intention. He moves with clarity, not hesitation. Others begin to recognize this shift more clearly. They see a man who has not withdrawn, but refined, who has not slowed, but focused, who is not merely protecting, but building with greater understanding than before. This perception carries influence. For those who continue to advance after others have ceased are often regarded with respect. They are seen as possessing insight, as understanding how to move when others remain still. And through this perception, new opportunities arise. There is a deeper realization that emerges from this process, that what feels safe is not always what leads forward. That comfort, when left unexamined, may become confinement. And that protection, when not balanced with growth, quietly limits the future it seeks to secure. Thus, the most dangerous aspect of this shift is not that it appears harmful, but that it appears correct. It allows a man to continue without question, to act without disruption, and to remain without immediate consequence. Yet over time, the cost becomes evident, not in sudden loss, but in absence of gain. And so it may be said that the first and most subtle mistake is not reckless action, but excessive caution. Not the pursuit of opportunity, but the quiet withdrawal from it. The man who recognizes this does not reject safety, he redefines it. He understands that true security is not found in standing still, but in continuing to move with awareness, with intention, and with direction. And in that understanding, his future begins to open once again. There is a tendency in every man to rely upon what has worked before. This tendency is not weakness, it is the mind's way of seeking efficiency. When a pattern produces result, it is repeated. When repeated often enough, it becomes habit. And habit, once established, operates without conscious direction. In earlier years, this process serves a man well. He discovers methods that allow him to earn, to manage, and to maintain his position. Through repetition, these methods become reliable. They require less thought, less effort, and provide a sense of stability. For a time, they are effective. Yet what is seldom considered is that conditions change. Time alters opportunity. Experience alters perspective. Position alters possibility. And what once produced progress may, over time, produce only continuation. The habit remains, but its effectiveness diminishes. This is where the danger begins. The man does not immediately recognize that the pattern has changed in value. He continues as before, trusting in what has always worked. The familiarity of the habit creates confidence, even when the results no longer justify it. He saves in the same manner. He spends in the same manner. He directs his resources according to patterns formed years earlier. And because these actions feel correct, they are not questioned. Yet beneath this repetition lies a quiet truth. The environment in which those habits were formed no longer exists in the same way. What once required caution may now require positioning. What once produced steady growth may now produce only maintenance. What once was sufficient may now be limiting. There are many individuals who find themselves in this condition without realizing it. They have done what they were taught. They have been disciplined, consistent, and responsible. Yet when they look closely, they see that their position has not advanced as expected. Years pass and little changes. This is not because they failed to act. It is because they continued to act in a way that no longer produces advancement. There is a subtle difference between repeating what works and repeating what once worked. The first creates progress. The second creates stagnation. Consider the man who learned early to save a portion of his income. This habit served him well. It created discipline, prevented waste, and allowed him to build a foundation. Yet if this habit remains unchanged without adaptation, it may not lead him further. He may continue saving, yet without directing those savings toward growth, the result remains limited. The habit continues, but the outcome does not expand. Another man may have learned to avoid uncertainty entirely. In his earlier years, This protected him from unnecessary loss. Yet later in life, this same habit may prevent him from engaging with opportunity that requires thoughtful movement. In both cases, the habit is not wrong, it is incomplete. And when left unexamined, incompleteness becomes limitation. There is an affirmation that may be applied to interrupt this pattern. I examine what I repeat and refine it toward greater result. This statement introduces awareness into what was once automatic. It does not reject habit, it refines it. It reminds the individual that repetition must evolve if it is to remain effective. As this awareness develops, the individual begins to observe his own patterns more closely. He notices where he acts without thinking, where he follows routine without question, where decisions are made not from intention, but from familiarity. This observation is the beginning of change. At first, it may feel uncomfortable. Habit provides certainty, and questioning it introduces uncertainty. The individual may hesitate, unsure whether to alter what has long been trusted. Yet it is not necessary to abandon everything. It is necessary to examine everything. He must ask, does this pattern still lead me forward? Does it produce growth or merely continuation? Is it aligned with where I am now or where I once was? These questions begin to reshape his thinking. He no longer assumes that what worked before will continue to do so. He begins to adapt, to adjust, to refine his approach in accordance with his present condition. Others who make this shift are often perceived differently. They appear more aware, more engaged, and more responsive to change. They do not cling to old methods out of comfort. They adjust their course with intention. This gives them an advantage. For while others repeat without question, they refine without hesitation. They are seen as sharp, deliberate, and forward-moving qualities that attract opportunity and increase influence. There is also a shift in confidence that accompanies this process. The individual no longer relies solely upon what he has done in the past. He trusts his ability to examine, to decide, and to act in the present. This confidence is not based on memory, it is based on awareness. And awareness, when applied consistently, produces control. It must be understood that habits are not enemies, they are tools. But like all tools, they must be suited to the task at hand. When the task changes, the tool must be adjusted. Otherwise, what once helped will begin to hinder. Many never make this adjustment. They continue as before, not because it is effective, but because it is familiar. They avoid the effort of rethinking, the discomfort of change, and the uncertainty of new direction. And in doing so, they remain where they are. The cost is not immediate, it is gradual. It appears in years that pass without advancement, in opportunities that go unnoticed, in potential that remains unrealized. Yet the individual who chooses to examine his patterns interrupts this process. He begins to evolve his habits. He refines his decisions. He aligns his actions with his present understanding rather than his past assumptions. And through this, something begins to change. Not dramatically at first, but steadily, consistently, purposefully. He is no longer repeating for the sake of continuity. He is repeating for the sake of growth. And that difference, though small in appearance, is powerful in effect. for it transforms habit from a force of limitation into a force of advancement, and in that transformation, his financial path begins to move forward once again. There is a belief that grows stronger in many men as the years advance, and though it appears to be rooted in wisdom, it often becomes one of the greatest limitations to progress. It is the belief that risk must be avoided, that safety must be preserved above all else, and that uncertainty is something to be minimized at every opportunity. This belief does not arise suddenly. It is shaped through experience, through moments of loss, and through the natural desire to protect what has been built. Yet when carried too far, it produces a condition that is far more dangerous than the risks it seeks to avoid. In earlier years, a man may act with greater boldness. He is willing to move into the unknown, to test possibilities, and to accept that uncertainty is part of advancement. His perspective allows him to see opportunity where others see danger. But as time passes, there is a gradual shift. The memory of mistakes becomes more vivid than the memory of progress. The desire to avoid loss begins to outweigh the desire to create gain. And from this shift, a new pattern forms. This pattern is not immediately harmful. It encourages caution, and caution has its place. It prevents reckless action and guards against unnecessary loss. Yet when caution becomes the dominant force, it begins to restrict movement. The man no longer evaluates opportunity with balance. He views it through the lens of avoidance. He does not ask what may be gained, but what might be lost, and in doing so, he limits his own advancement. There is a critical distinction that must be understood. Risk in itself is not the danger. Ignorance is the danger. Action taken without understanding leads to loss. But action taken with thought, with preparation, and with clear direction creates possibility. To avoid all risk is to avoid all movement beyond the present condition. It is to remain where one is, not because it is best, but because it is familiar. Many men reach a stage where they believe that stillness is safety. They hold their position, protect their resources, and refrain from engaging with anything that appears uncertain. To them, this feels responsible. It feels controlled. Yet over time, this stillness produces a different effect. It reduces opportunity, limits growth, and creates a slow decline that is not immediately visible. This decline does not appear as loss. It appears as absence. Absence of increase, absence of movement, absence of progress. The man continues, but he does not advance. He preserves, but he does not build. And because there is no immediate consequence, the pattern continues. There are many examples of individuals who have lived within this condition. They avoided what they perceived as risk, remained within what they understood, and protected their position with care. Yet years passed, and they found that their position had not improved. In some cases, it had weakened not through action, but through inaction. In contrast, there are those who came to understand risk differently. They did not seek it blindly, nor did they avoid it entirely. They examined it. They asked what could be understood, what could be controlled, and what could be directed. They moved not with impulse, but with intention. And through this, they positioned themselves where growth remained possible. Such individuals are often perceived differently by others. They are not seen as reckless, but as composed, not as careless, but as deliberate. There is a confidence in their actions that comes not from ignoring risk, but from understanding it. This perception creates trust, and from trust comes opportunity. There is an affirmation that supports this shift in thinking. I act with understanding, not fear, and I move where growth is possible. This statement does not remove caution, it places it in balance. It reminds the individual that fear is not a guide, but a signal to think more clearly. As this idea takes hold, the individual begins to observe his own behavior more closely. He notices where he has avoided action, not because it was unwise, but because it was uncertain. He recognizes moments where opportunity was present, yet dismissed without examination. This awareness is not meant to produce regret, but to create adjustment. At first, this adjustment may be small. The individual may begin by examining opportunities more carefully, asking questions rather than turning away. He may consider what can be learned, what can be controlled, and what aligns with his direction. Through this process, uncertainty becomes something to be understood rather than something to be feared. There is also a change in perception. What once appeared as risk begins to appear as possibility. Not guaranteed, not without challenge, but available. The individual begins to see that movement requires some degree of uncertainty, and that without it, growth cannot occur. Others begin to notice this shift. They see a man who is no longer withdrawn, but engaged, who considers before acting, but does not avoid action entirely. There is a balance in his approach that suggests both caution and confidence. This balance is uncommon and therefore valuable. It must be understood that this change does not require reckless action. It requires thoughtful action. The individual must still consider, still evaluate, still decide with care. But he must not allow fear to prevent him from moving forward when understanding supports it. There may be moments of hesitation where old patterns attempt to return. The individual may feel the familiar pull toward avoidance, the suggestion that it is safer to remain as he is. In these moments, he must rely upon his awareness. He must recognize that avoidance, when repeated, leads not to safety, but to limitation. Through continued application, the new pattern begins to strengthen. The individual becomes more comfortable with examining uncertainty, more capable of making informed decisions, and more willing to act when direction is clear. This willingness does not increase risk, it increases opportunity. There is a gradual expansion that occurs. The individual finds that his world is no longer confined to what he has always known. He begins to engage with new possibilities, to position himself differently, and to move beyond the limits he once accepted. Others respond to this change. They begin to see him as someone who is still advancing, still building, still engaged with the future, rather than retreating from it. This perception enhances his position, attracting opportunities that would not have appeared otherwise. Thus, the misunderstanding of risk is corrected. The individual no longer seeks to eliminate it entirely, nor does he embrace it blindly. He understands it, directs it, and uses it as a tool for movement. He recognizes that the greatest danger is not in taking a thoughtful step forward, but in remaining still when movement is required. And in this recognition, he begins to move again. There is a belief held by many men, often without conscious thought, that time itself will bring improvement. That if one remains steady, continues working, and avoids major error, circumstances will gradually shift in his favor. This belief is comforting, for it removes urgency. It allows a man to proceed without questioning whether his direction is correct, trusting that time will resolve what effort alone has not yet produced. In earlier years, this belief appears to hold truth. A man works, gains experience, increases his income, and sees gradual improvement. The passage of time seems to reward consistency. From this, he forms a conclusion that time combined with effort will continue to elevate his position. Yet what is seldom examined is whether the same conditions remain. Time in itself does not create progress. It amplifies what is already in motion. If a man is moving in the right direction, time strengthens his results. But if he is repeating the same patterns without advancement, time does not correct this, it reinforces it. It turns repetition into permanence. This is where the danger lies. A man may continue for years under the assumption that things will improve, while his position remains largely unchanged. He does not see immediate loss, and so he assumes progress is occurring. Yet when he pauses to reflect, he finds that the movement he expected has not taken place. This realization often comes quietly. It does not arrive with sudden failure, but with comparison between what was expected and what has occurred. The gap is not dramatic, but it is noticeable. Enough time has passed that change should be visible. Yet it is not. There are many who encounter this moment and choose to dismiss it. They tell themselves that more time is needed, that patience will resolve what has not yet materialized, and in doing so, they continue in the same pattern, extending the very condition that produced the result. But time does not correct direction, it reveals it. If a man continues without adjustment, time becomes a force that deepens his current position. It does not move him forward, it carries him further along the same path. And if that path does not lead where he intends, the distance traveled only makes correction more difficult. Consider the individual who relies solely on continued effort and passive progression. He works, earns, and maintains, believing that his position will strengthen over the years. Yet, without deliberate redirection, his efforts produce only what they have always produced: continuation, not expansion. In contrast, there are those who come to understand time differently. They do not rely upon it, they direct it. They recognize that each year must be used intentionally, that each period must contribute to something beyond itself. They do not wait for improvement, they construct it. Such individuals are often perceived with a different sense of presence. They do not appear hurried, yet they are never idle in thought. Their actions are measured, their decisions deliberate, and their progress visible. Others recognize in them a quality of control, as though they are not being carried by time, but are shaping it. There is an affirmation that supports this understanding. Time serves me only when I direct it with purpose. This statement introduces responsibility where there was once assumption. It reminds the individual that time alone is neutral. It must be guided to produce result. As this idea takes hold, the individual begins to examine his use of time more closely. He no longer measures it by how it passes, but by what it produces. He asks whether each period contributes to growth, whether his actions are aligned with movement, and whether his direction leads forward. This examination produces awareness of a different kind. He begins to notice where time has been spent without result, where effort has been applied without accumulation, and where continuation has replaced intention. This awareness is not meant to create regret, but to inspire adjustment. There may be resistance at this stage. The mind is accustomed to believing that consistency alone is sufficient. It suggests that continued effort will eventually produce change, even without alteration. Yet this suggestion must be questioned, for it has already been tested. The individual must consider whether his past pattern, extended into the future, will produce a different outcome. If not, then time will not solve the condition, it will sustain it. As this realization deepens, a shift begins to occur. The individual becomes more deliberate in how he uses his time. He begins to allocate portions of it toward actions that produce lasting effect